I've been asked to speak about burning priorities, as you can see. Just a little bit about our company. For those of you who don't know Staffing Industry Analysts, we're a research organisation. We're the only company that provides global research on the staffing industry. Our members are people that supply services to staffing firms, so some of the people that are sponsoring this event, for example. It includes investment banks who follow the staffing industry, looking at listed staffing firms, some of the consulting firms as well. Of course, staffing firms, the largest global staffing firms, many of them are members of our services, but also lots of small staffing firms, but also clients of staffing firms as well. These are the clients that we have. So we advise these companies on procuring contingent labour around the world. We think we're in quite a fortunate position because obviously advising the suppliers and the buyers gives us a pretty good view of what's happening in the market. If you add up all the spend that these companies spend on contingent labour each year, it's about a third of the global temporary staffing market. So I've been asked to speak about burning priorities, so I've got 6 topics to talk about. Definition, reputation, privation, by which I mean skill shortages, which have obviously already been discussed this morning, disintermediation, automation, and sophistication. So the first one, definition. I've been asked to come here and speak about employment and recruitment. Interestingly, that's not a definition that we actually use within our company. We obviously use, if you think about our company name, Staffing Industry Analysts, we use the term staffing industry. For us, the staffing industry includes temporary staffing. It includes place and search. So place and search would include direct hire from a US perspective. It would include permanent placement. It could include executive search as well. So that, for us, is the staffing industry. The problem with this slide is about 15 years out of date. There are new services that many staffing firms are starting to take advantage of. It could include payrolling. It could include MSP, RPO. There are all these sort of peripheral services that are starting to develop within the industry. And it's even more complicated than that. For us, this is now the extended workforce ecosystem. There's all sorts of new services and affiliated services that many staffing firms are looking at, but also that compete against the staffing industry as well. So I think one interesting thing for Ciett and all the other national associations to think about with the branding exercise that Ciett is going through is where does the staffing industry actually stop and where does it begin? Should the associations be thinking about this broader ecosystem rather than just the narrow staffing industry? There's another component of it as well, which I think is quite interesting, and these are the 3 services that I've highlighted here, the human cloud, and that's where we tend to see a lot of innovation happening at the moment. Online staffing, online services, crowdsourcing as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those in a bit more detail. Another way to look at the market, if we look at the workers operating this contingent ecosystem, well, agency temps are actually a relatively small portion of it. So the spend on agency temps worldwide, we reckon, is about 267 billion euro, but companies use other sorts of temps as well. They use independent contractors, they use statement of work consultants as well. The interesting thing was with the advantage of new technologies and some of these new services that are being developed within the industry, there are staffing companies that are starting to tap into the opportunities for some of these other workers, not just agency temps. So again, opportunities for some of the more forward-thinking companies that operate in our industry. Definition, just to finish on that, is a real challenge for everybody. I think one thing that I think we could all collaborate a little bit better on is actually defining this market a lot better. We constantly try to understand it. It's complicated because it keeps changing. And we look forward to working with national associations and with Ciett in actually trying to develop an understanding of the industry that we can all agree with and hopefully agree on some consistent terminology as well. So reputation, I wanted to discuss. You will be well aware that you operate in a market where there's lots and lots of restrictions on temporary agency work. Clearly the challenge that you have is to improve the reputation of temporary agency work, and also by that means getting rid of some of these restrictions on temporary agency work. There is movement all the time. Every year there's changes. Obviously there's been some changes recently here in Italy. The two countries highlighted in red are where governments have announced they will be lifting some of these restrictions. So this is all very, very positive. Your role, your main role, is to improve the reputation of the industry, I would suggest. To be clear, this is not my role. We are independent observers of the market, so we report on trends in the market, whether they are seen as positive for the industry or indeed negative. So negative trends, like the reputation of the industry in some markets, there are countries where the impression that people have about temporary agency work is so hostile that there will be national strikes against the industry. One of the examples on here, India, which was actually a company-specific issue, they actually burnt the HR manager to death. So you operate in an industry where people are willing to kill people for providing temporary agency work. So I do think that you face an enormous challenge still in improving the reputation of the industry globally, and particularly in markets where there are low-waged economies. Privation, so skill shortages. I don't mean to discuss this for a particularly long time because we've already discussed it this morning. You will all be aware that we face an aging population. It's particularly severe in markets in Southern Europe and in Germany as well. I would say as well that although this means that for any staffing companies there's increased challenges in finding talented workers, it's not a wholly negative trend because this is also an opportunity for you to improve your margins, to increase your prices. The more skill shortages there are, the more clients will need to rely on staffing agencies to find the people that they need. Hays provides quite a nice index each year where they actually look at the level of skills shortages in a particular country. So as you can see from this scale, 5 is regarded as a good balance between supply and demand for skills in a particular country. Anything with a higher score, that's where there's increasing skill shortages. Anywhere with a lower score, that's actually where skill shortages are getting better in any particular year. Interestingly, they think that skill shortages are not such a severe problem in Italy this particular year. I don't know whether any of the staffing firms in the room would actually agree with that.
Bad news for Italy.
Yeah. Well, no, it's good news for Italy. I mean, the skill shortages are improving. I mean, it's bad news for places like Sweden and the US and Spain, where it's difficult for companies to find the right skills to do the work that they need. Another related topic to this is the immigration, because actually there's not a global skill shortage. The problem is all the workers are in the wrong countries. Business would benefit from a much more mobile labour market. So unfortunately, the general population doesn't seem to agree with that. So instead of increasing mobility, what we see in many countries around the world, including in Europe, is that governments are putting up barriers to allowing skilled workers into a particular country. This is just some EU data. I mean, interestingly, if we had no immigration at all in Europe, then the population would have been declining since 2012. Even with the current levels of immigration that we have, which many people are concerned about, the European population still starts to decline from 2035. So I think there's a real challenge. I don't think there's any easy solutions for this, but governments are faced with this contradiction about business needing the workers to enable them to grow their business, but the local population is actually reacting badly to immigrant labour.
And this is important for many people who are frightened by immigration. Huh?
Yeah, it is.
You see the difference between the two lines. The red one is going down dramatically.
Yeah. No? Well, of course, the other thing, if you look at that slide, when it says the decline in immigration starts in 2035, that's also the decline in the people who are paying the taxes that pay all our pensions as well. So.
Exactly.
So disintermediation. So I just wanted to talk about one threat to the staffing industry as I see it, and that's online staffing, part of that human cloud that I mentioned previously. Now, I do think it's very interesting because in many ways, online staffing, as we refer to it, is very similar to straightforward temporary staffing. You have a worker, you have an intermediary, and then you have clients who need to get some work done. So to be clear, what we mean by online staffing, these are freelance platforms. Companies like Elance, Odesk, which has recently rebranded to Upwork. There's another example in Australia is freelancer.com, freelance.com in France as well. There are many companies that are operating these services, and they are very similar to what the staffing industry does from a sort of conceptual level. But in another respect, they're completely different, because the temporary staffing industry, as we've seen, operates under a huge burden of legislation. You're faced with incredible legislation in many respects. All these people on the right, the online staffing providers, they have no legislation to worry about. They're operating in an almost free environment. Governments are yet to catch up with these services and make sure that they are categorized appropriately. So these freelance platforms, they're not worried about whether the freelance worker is actually paying the appropriate tax, because it's not their problem. It's up to the freelance worker to make sure that they're paying the right tax. So they have a significant advantage over any traditional staffing company. Not surprisingly, many staffing companies have started to invest in these online staffing models. Companies like Adecco, Randstad, Recruit have made investments in this area, and we do see others making investments, because it's actually entirely complementary to what the staffing industry does as well. There are many people who would just not bother to go into your office to register as a temporary worker. Housewives who have got family responsibilities, disabled people who are stuck at home, who can't get out of the house. Many other people who just would not bother to work as a temporary worker can still work as a freelance worker at home, doing work remotely. Of course, not all work can be done remotely, but a lot of work can be done remotely, and increasingly with technology, more and more work can be done remotely. So while I would say that this does pose a bit of a threat to the staffing industry, I don't think it's going to replace the staffing industry, but it's got the potential to nibble away at your value chain, because you know, we used to use temporary staff to do transcripts from the conferences that we put on. We don't bother anymore. We go to one of these freelance workers, and it's done much more cost effectively by somebody in India. These online staffing firms, just as a matter of interest, this sector is still so small that you're able to count the number of companies that operate. So we think there's about 196 of them. And unlike a lot of innovations that we see around the world that start in the US, actually there are more online staffing platforms in China. In China, these platforms are called Witkeys. But you can see that it's a global phenomenon. They are developed in many different countries, and also, you know, they are global in respect that they also provide options for companies to hire workers in any part of the world. We estimate that particular market at the moment is worth about 1.5 billion euros, so it's really small compared to the size of the staffing industry. But it's about the most fastest growing part of the staffing industry as well. You can see we've put some forecasts together. We've given ourselves quite a big margin of error, but we reckon that a conservative forecast would be a growth of about 40% each year. So by 2020, this industry could be worth anything upwards of 32 billion. So something of real interest that is happening globally at the moment.
So it's growing really fast.
Growing really fast, yeah. And it's why a lot of staffing firms have started to invest in it, because it's growing faster than the traditional staffing industry. So automation, I wanted to talk about automation. So in terms of threats to the industry, I've worked in the staffing industry for about 25 years. And I've seen lots of threats. People talked about job boards replacing the staffing industry. They're worried about vendor management systems and MSP and how that might destroy the industry. Now everybody seems to be worried about LinkedIn and what the potential for that is to do. I think these all pale into insignificance compared to what I regard as the next threat. So at the end of 2013, there were two Oxford University academics called Frey and Osborne who took a very close look at the US labour market. And they came to the conclusion that 47% of all US employment is at risk of replacement through automation over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, they gave themselves quite a broad space of years, 10 to 20 years, but that was because they could only do their evaluation based on current technology. They couldn't guess what technology might be invented in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. So this could happen faster. It may happen, but I can't imagine it would actually happen any slower.
So that means that if I were American, I should be really, really very worried?
You should be worried, but unfortunately the data that they did is just based on the US market, but of course the US is very similar to a lot of other developed economies as well. So while the number's 47% for the US, it could just as be as high in the market that you operate in. But the scary thing about it, there's been lots of industrial revolutions in the past, and it's normally affected blue-collar jobs. This one directly hits white-collar jobs. What sort of jobs does it impact? Well, these are the sort of probabilities that Frey and Osborne came up with. This is just a snapshot across a number of different jobs. They regarded anything that scored higher than 0.7 on this scale as being at high risk. You can see low risk is any jobs that have a real personal touch, things like therapists, dentists, trainers, the clergy. The clergy are very safe. Firefighters, actors, although I think we could replace some actors with robots, it might improve things. Economists, pilots, and then it starts to get a little bit difficult. Word processors, real estate agents, salespeople, accountants and auditors, interestingly, and telemarketers. Telemarketers, the score is 0.99.
No journalists.
Journalists aren't in here, but you will probably be aware that there is already software that you can use that can write more quickly than journalists.
Let me tell you that my job is dramatically changing.
Yeah. Everyone is at risk. Yeah. You're not safe.
Okay. Okay. This is a kind of private interest in a public conference. Okay.
Yeah. But actually, one of the safest jobs is managers. So if you're in a managerial role, you're already safe. It's probably not yourself you need to be worried about. It's what jobs your children have. So if we look at what do I mean by artificial intelligence and robotics? Well, of course, it's robots. You'll be familiar. There have been robots operating on production lines for years and years and years. They replace blue-collar jobs, but robots these days are much more adept, much more nimble, and they've got the potential to get involved in a lot more things. Drones. EasyJet replaced some of the engineers that they have with drones. When the plane lands, little drones fly around the aircraft and see if they can spot any faults. That used to be a job done by people. It's now done by drones. Amazon are investing a huge amount of money in drones for delivery. I don't think we'll see that happening over the next year, but maybe in 2-3 years' time, all deliveries will be made by drones. Bots. The first bots that most people would be familiar with are things like spiders that search engines used to use. But now the bots, we see chatbots, things like Siri, which I'm sure many of you will use. They've got the potential to impact work. Software substitution, when you check in at the airport, you're not having to deal with people so much. When you're checking out at the supermarket, there used to be all these people helping you. Now there's still people at the checkout, but there's a lot of ways you can serve yourself as well. So software substitution is one of the much more subtle ways that you see jobs being replaced. But by robotics, I also mean this. So Daimler, last month, introduced the first self-driving lorry. It's being tested on US roads at the moment. Apparently in the US, 40,000 people are killed by lorries each year. 90% of those casualties are caused by driver error. So technology has moved and improved to such an extent that insurance companies are going to start looking at this and actually realize that it's a safer way, and of course companies are looking at it as a cheaper way. If you operate in the logistics sector, I would say that you would need to be worried about this. We have very, very good data on the US staffing market, so we're able to look at, based on Frey and Osborne's study of employment generally, we're able to look at what impact that this might make on temporary staffing specifically. And our conclusion, if 47% is right for general employment, it will affect 63% of all temporary agency jobs. They're all susceptible to replacement over the next 10 to 20 years. So what I would say with that number is, let's assume it's wildly exaggerated. Let's say it's only half that. Let's say it's 30%. Let's say it's only a quarter of that. It's only 15%. That's still a lot of your business that just evaporates away and disappears. And as you can see from the categories on here, as I said, it's the white-collar jobs. So office clerical staffing sector's affected for sure. Industrial is affected. But look at finance and accounting. That is the sector that is most affected by this particular trend. The ones that are lower down here, things like IT, legal, education, healthcare, engineering, there are still skill sectors within those particular categories that face a particular threat. The big question is, of course, in the past, when we've seen an industrial revolution like this, jobs have been replaced. Jobs have been lost on an individual level. It's been catastrophic. But actually, better jobs have replaced the jobs that have been lost. The big question is, do we think that with this new trend that there will be new jobs that are replacing the jobs that are lost? And also, are you confident enough in the education systems in your countries that you will be able to find the candidates to actually find these new jobs? So I do think that if you operate in any of these categories, it's important you keep a close eye on this trend, because if you're seeing a slowing trend and you can't understand what's happening, it could well be because of automation. So that paints a rather miserable picture of the future, I realise, but I do think that there are opportunities here. Any sort of disruption to the economy, temporary staffing firms normally do well, because if employers are uncertain about what's happening, they're more likely to use temporary workers. But if you're thinking about what does the staffing industry look like in 10 years' time, well, there's no reason why staffing firms couldn't be supplying artificial intelligence and robotic solutions to their clients. There are already staffing firms in Japan that will provide robots to their clients. The example on here is a company based in New York called WorkFusion, who I would regard as very much at the cutting edge of the staffing industry. Because what they will do when they speak to a client, they will consult with them and say, do you need a temporary worker? Or do you want to use one of these freelance operatives who are based remotely in another country? Or do you actually need some software to help you do that job? Or do you need a combination of the two? Do you need a temporary worker plus the software? So what I would see as the future of the staffing industry is actually companies that are not just supplying people, that are also providing artificial intelligence to get work done. And the final topic I wanted to cover is sophistication. One way that we've seen the staffing industry become more sophisticated is with the growth of managed service provision. We're going to do a little session later on this afternoon. We're going to be talking about RPO and MSP in a lot more detail. So any of you that are interested in this particular, then of course I hope you'll join this particular session. But we have seen managed service provision grow globally. You can see some of the percentage growth rates are incredibly high, but that's because the number of programs in those particular countries are quite low. In the US market, where there are 1,600 MSPs, is still growing at 19%. About half of all temporary workers in the US these days are provided via an MSP. It's much lower in the rest of the world. I don't think what's going to happen is that we're going to see the same growth in the rest of the world that we've seen in the US, that you'll see that level of penetration, because there are other sort of hurdles. There are slimmer margins in some markets, which mean it's difficult for an intermediary like an MSP to participate in the supply chain. There are some legal obstacles in some markets as well. But nevertheless, you can see that there is tremendous growth in this. So this is one of the ways that in the past that the industry has become more sophisticated.
Why is such a big difference in Europe, between Germany and the other countries?
Well, Germany is very much a younger staffing market, it's starting from a very small base.
So yeah. That's why they're increasing so hard.
I would say as well, I mean, one other thing you need to bear in mind with that growth is that we do see that the growth is very much driven by international companies. These are mostly US companies that have got an MSP program in place in the US that want to develop it globally. So we still don't see that there's much demand nationally for some of these solutions in some markets. So MSP is one of the ways that staffing firms that provide those services have been able to tap into some of these other labour categories, because if you use an MSP, you won't necessarily just be helping your clients source temporary agency workers, you'll be helping them find independent contractors on online workers. But if we think about what might happen in the future, any company any organisation uses a range of different options, looks at different options in terms of getting work done. They can hire people, they can hire full-time workers, they may use temporary workers, they can go to an independent contractor, they could use one of these online platforms these days, but also they can look at professional services, they can outsource solutions, they've got partners to worry about that get work done, other people in their supply chain, actually informal volunteers, people who are willing to do work for your company for free. There are franchisees as well. And of course, as we've just discussed, now some of the solutions are not even human. There are artificial intelligence to think about as well. We do lots of surveys about the proportion of non-employees that companies use. The most recent one, companies tell us that they use about 16%. 16% of the way they get work done is done by non-employees. Now, the interesting thing about that is all the employees, there's a lot of focus given into motivating them, retaining them, making sure they're paid well. All the non-employees, there's much less focus on that. So companies aren't very joined up in their thinking. If you're a client of one of these businesses, you're not sure whether somebody is employed on a full-time basis or a temporary basis or whatever basis. So if you're disappointed by the service that you're getting from a particular company, you couldn't care less what their employment status is. Yet companies are very much focused on just developing, training their full-time staff at the expense of non-employees. So when we look at what is the next important trends, we see it as this, total talent management. And total talent management refers to a practice whereby a company will look at their workforce needs on a much more holistic basis. They will understand all these different workforce categories. They will know what is the right option in any particular circumstance. Is it more cost-effective to hire a temporary worker rather than hire somebody on a full-time basis? Is it better to outsource it? And the problem is, of course, that all of this is not joined up within companies because the people who are making decision on whether it's outsourced, whether you use a temporary worker, permanent worker, they're quite often different people in the company. So total talent management means that companies understand where the best solutions are and also actually can measure and make decisions appropriately. There are already some of the more forward-thinking staffing companies that are offering what they call total talent initiatives. I've given examples of some of these on the screen. The one at the bottom, TAPFIN, part of Manpower Group, they refer to integrated resource fulfillment, but effectively it's total talent management. Another example of how we're using different terminology to refer to the same thing. So this is a positive trend. These companies are realizing that their clients are looking for a much more holistic solution. But I would suggest that there's a problem that we all face. Oh, sorry, we seem to have lost a slide. Do we lost a slide? Oh, okay, slide disappeared. Yeah, so there's a problem that we all face because what they're actually talking about is total talent resourcing. They're talking about finding workers. But as I explained, total talent management is not just about finding the workers, it's actually about understanding their needs and trying to retain them and trying to motivate them the same way that you would your full-time staff. So it's a much more broader HR thing. So I think while these companies are forward-thinking and more advanced than most companies, there's actually a much bigger piece of the pie for companies to take advantage of. Not just about resourcing, companies who are interested in total talent management are actually much more interested in a broader set of things beyond just finding these people. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that one thing that I think the industry will face is pricing transparency. The reason I believe that is that there's a company called Brightfield Strategies that are pretty much set on making sure that your clients will know exactly what the right price is and what the what the cost of a temporary worker is. The good news is that they would make this available to you as well. The way they're able to do that is they're speaking to all the VMS providers, they're speaking to the clients of the VMS providers, and they're telling them to send all their temporary data to them so that they can consolidate it and make sense of it. So they're able to tell a client in any particular country, in any particular sector, any particular skill set, what is the right price to pay. And they're not only going to do that with VMS, they're going to look at applicant tracking systems and other sorts of technology as well. because clients want to know that data. The one question we get asked by clients most often is, what is the right price to pay? And we can't answer it because we don't know. I think, even for the people in the room that provide these services, it's not always clear. Of course, you'll get the best price that you can get, but what is the best price? I don't mean the cheapest price. What is the best price to make sure that you get the right skills? And of course, this is a gateway to what I've just been talking about, total talent management as well. So, I do think that that's an intriguing thing that's going to be happening in the future. And then finally, just two dramatic alternatives for the future. If we're looking at burning priorities, well, we could face acceleration. If we get things right, if we do improve the reputation of the industry by all the good work that you're doing, then there's no reason why we can't continue to see lots of good growth within the industry. But there are threats. There's always been threats in the past, and the staffing industry has proved itself to be remarkably adept at dealing with them. Hopefully that will continue, so we won't face the other scenario that I've given on this slide of extinction. So do pay attention to the trends, and best of luck with the rest of the conference.